Okay, welcome to the Joe Green JFK podcast. As I lumber around trying to figure out what I'm doing. What I'm doing this week is I am dropping a conversation between myself and the author Jasun Horsley. I think I explained pretty well why I wanted to speak with Jason in the very first comment that I make. This is the first time we've ever spoken with one another at all. We decided to just go ahead and do it as a recording, and so it's very much a conversation.
And then we'll just see what happens.
Um, just to say hello and make contact. I should probably the origin story of how I discovered your book. I run a small press, basically an imprint that was basically designed for me to be able to publish my own work. But I, as a consequence of doing that, I ended up publishing my late mentor John Judge's book called Judge for Yourself. And then I published a friend of mine's book, Richard Bartholomew, his book on the Kennedy assassination in Texas. And I also write these zines for an entity called Microcosm Publishing in Portland, here in the States. And my wife, in the last 5 years, has suddenly become a best-selling author through that publishing house. And so we go in, well, before the pandemic, before all this crap happened, we regularly, maybe once a year, we'd go out to Portland, and we go out to their main facility, which is also a bookstore, in addition to being their main publishing area. Mm-hmm. And so they have all kinds of books, and I always wander through and I go, oh, this is interesting. You got this, you get this. And I came across Prisoner of Infinity, and I looked at it and I go, wow, this looks interesting. And so I picked it up, and I was reading it on our way home. So we're flying out, and I'm reading it on the plane, and I'm talking to my wife about it, and she's sort of used to me going on and on about things. And I'm reading this book and going, holy shit. Hey, did you know this? And of course, she this is not her field, mm-hmm. So to speak. And I hadn't had that experience in a long time. You get to the point in this, if you're familiar with The Sopranos, I frequently refer to this as our thing. The way they refer to it as the mafia. Mm-hmm. Which is to say the entire the entire field of parapolitical conspiracy research, all this stuff that is connected at various points, although not everybody agrees on which points are connected and which aren't. Right. But you read a sufficient amount of this material, and a lot of times when you're looking at a book, you kind of know, oh, okay, this is this kind of book, and this is what it's going to say. And this, but it's been a long time since I'd read something that completely took my head off. That was, you're dealing with a topic that I'm not very familiar with. So, which is to say, like UFO. I'm not well versed in UFO, ufology, beyond. Ken Thomas and Jacques Vallée a little bit, and what was the other one the guy who wrote the Mothman Prophecies? I think I have one of his other books.
Don't Kill.
Yes, yeah, Kill. And it's not really my field. It's not really my area. But when you were writing about, so I was totally unfamiliar with Whitley Strieber's work. Other than I knew who he was. I knew he had written Communion. And when I was a kid, I saw the Christopher Walken picture on TV. So the idea that Straver had written all of this stuff, had written all these books, and had gotten into ritual abuse and the connections that you make in this book.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was also a screenwriter who wrote Wolfen, and he'd written a vampire pig. It's just what, and he's from San Antonio, which is where I live.
Right.
And so it was there were synchronous elements to this story, but also I was just so impressed by the connections that you were making organically from this information. I didn't feel that you were straining or that you were trying to say something that wasn't there. I was very impressed. And so and then after that, I reached out to you, and then I read The Vice of Kings. And of course, all of that has become very much in the major media now, although, in the way that the major media covers these things, which is not very well. And so I just wanted to talk to you.
On that last point, do you mean the organized abuse aspect of Vice of Kings, or are you referring even to the Fabian Society? Because apparently they are getting a bit more airtime recently.
I'm referring to the abuse stuff. The Fabian Society, I don't think that people are ever going to really. I think that's too abstract a notion for most people to get into, but that's just me. I mean, I discovered about the Fabian Society when I was researching H.G. Wells, and I came across, there's a book that collects H.G. Wells' letters to and I just lost her name. The lady that started Planned Parenthood in the United States. I can't even think of it. Anyway, and they talk about the Fabian Society, and that's the first thing that I had encountered that suggested that abortion was tied to an actual eugenics movement. And I wasn't familiar with that stuff at that point. And then I started digging and found there's a really good book by Edwin Black called War Against the Weak that gets into the eugenics aspect of it, which you're probably familiar with all this stuff, but
no, I'm not.
Oh, good. Yeah. Edwin Black he's an American journalist. He's excellent. He's written several tremendous books. He's a great researcher. And that eugenics movement, which is possibly tied to this international movement, as we've been all sort of digging in our different ways. But one of the things that I have found fascinating about all this is that if you just take it from the standpoint of, like, for example, the Catholic Church, right? Just to start with, I mean, Jimmy Savile is one thing, right? I mean, that's in the United States, people are not familiar with him at all, really. And I try to explain, it's sort of like, it's a little bit like Casey Kasem in the United States, or that we really don't have DJs at a national level anymore in this country. But it's like, this guy was, he knew everybody. He was familiar with the royals as well as every pop star imaginable. He was as integrated into the highest levels of society as you can be, really. And he was also conducted this 50-year campaign openly. It's just stunning. But in fact, we've had the same thing in the United States with the Catholic Church, and we had an Oscar-winning movie made about it a few years ago. And I was very surprised. It was a movie called Spotlight with Michael Keaton, at how open the film was about, not only is this is not a local problem, this is a national conspiracy, and it's an international conspiracy, because we are talking about the Catholic Church in Rome. I mean, this goes all the way back to Rome, and everyone is aware of this. And it looks like one of the reasons that you have set up this, this network of churches and priests is to abuse children. But that sort of surfaced and then it went away. And if people talk about abuse as in any kind of coordinated way, people would still think of you as a conspiracy theorist in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, and I wanted to, I guess the first question I wanted to ask you about is, why do you suppose that is, that you can have these people who are so prominent in their respective fields, engaging in incredibly open child abuse, and it doesn't resonate?
Well, the first reason I would say is that it's not really something that the intellect can grasp. And this is very much the subject of Prisoner of Infinity, which is why I'm always happy when I do meet somebody who grokked the book, because I don't know how many people are even capable of really receiving that book. I would say, compared to all the other books I've written, even, it's the most ambitious in many ways. I mean, 16 Months Fell is a huge book, so it's ambitious in different ways, but Prisoner of Infinity is perhaps even more ambitious in terms of it trying to get into a very abstract subject on the one hand, which is sociocultural engineering over the centuries, never mind the decades, while at the same time, this problem of organized ritual child abuse. Now, all my recent books are either directly about it or they're referring to it from seen and not seen onward, because once I started to become aware of it, that was, in a certain sense, it became the elephant in the room. And it's interesting if we think back to the early days of paranoid awareness, of parapolitical research, such as your mentor, John Judge or Mae Brussell. Organized child abuse wasn't really part of the picture back then. I mean, the satanic ritual abuse came up in the 80s, but somehow that was like its own, it was a fringe of the fringe almost. Like, it was pretty hard to find serious, rigorous researchers and analysts talking about satanic ritual abuse. I mean, that's slightly a side point, but my point is that for me, it's the head cornerstone that the research has rejected, so to speak. It's kind of the most central and the most inflammatory and the most damning and the most revealing aspect of the organized malevolence, that one way or another, every parapolitical researcher / conspiracy theorist, that latter term obviously being branded as the term of abuse nowadays officially, they're going to end up there sooner or later. And to come back to my original response, it's like, for me, even though I was aware of organized ritual abuse, organized child abuse, pedophile rings, certainly from at least the 90s, I'd say around the 90s. So a similar time that I was discovering Mae Brussell and John Judge, which was the late 80s. Pretty soon after that, if not simultaneously, I did hear about organized child abuse. So I was aware of it, but it was only when it really became more and more palpably apparent to me that it had impacted me personally. Like, there was some aspects of it, or some repercussions from that in my own childhood. I'm very cautious about stating it too emphatically, but if you read Vice of Kings, well, I've uncovered if I've, no smoking gun, but lots of smoke
Yeah.
and lots of bullet holes and stuff. So I am fairly persuaded by the evidence that something like that was happening to me as a child and to my siblings and so on. But even before that, there was this more and more growing sense of, why am I drawn to explore these dark aspects of society, and why, particularly when it started coming out around Jimmy Savile, initially I was resistant to actually exploring it, but my wife kept insisting that I needed to look at it, and eventually I assented, and that led to Occult Yorkshire, which became Vice of Kings. But once I did start digging, I couldn't stop digging. And one of the primary questions and motivations for my research, which is there in the books, is why am I doing this research? Because the answer is itself evidence. I mean, the question or the fact that I'm drawn to do the research is evidence. And the more I can discover about the reasons why, well, it's sort of circular, but I'm finding evidence for the thing that I'm researching by finding evidence for why I'm driven to research it, i.e. it's going on, right? If something like this was going on, it would be impacting all of us, one level or another, directly or indirectly. So of course, you can't be ambivalent about it. You're either going to be compulsively, borderline obsessively driven to get to the truth, or you're going to be repelled by it and what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, not quite offended, but this kind of scornful rejection of this is all conspiracy, that my brother had that attitude. Or you're going to be just apparently neutral, as in you're just not interested. But my point here is you can't be neutral about something like this. You can't. That's why there's an Oscar-winning movie about it. There has to be a safety valve, because nobody's really neutral, ambivalent about it or indifferent to it. But it's so difficult to get to grips with, even if you haven't been impacted by it directly. And I would say that the evidence, as I keep presenting the evidence, I also present the statistics from somebody like Lloyd DeMouse, which is still unbelievable to me. But it's something like, it's more than 50% of adults were sexually abused as children. I mean, the statistics that are gathered, it's not everybody but it's every other person possibly. I mean, as I say, I can't help be skeptical about statistics like that, because it just seems so incredible. But it's been backed up in my life, running a thrift store and interacting with many, many people, ordinary, everyday circumstances. How often actually it's come up, the people I just talked to, that they are victims of sexual abuse as children. And it's not because I say, hey, I'm the author of Vice of Kings, do you have any experience like this? Not at all. It's just that, well, I must give out a kind of vibe that I'm somebody that would receive that, and they would just tell me. And so more and more I've become able to believe that it really is as prevalent as the evidence about the organized cover-ups and stuff would suggest, and as the psychological statistics claim, as in it's just everywhere. And then the question is, well, as your question, well, how come nobody's talking about it, but how come there's still so much denial around it when it's out there in the open? And the answer is that, again, this is the difficult, subtle, abstract subject of Prisoner of Infinity, is psychological fragmentation, that we have compartmentalized of necessity the effects and the experience and the knowledge of child abuse, sexual or ritual, or there's a very large spectrum. There's also psychological, mental, verbal abuse, and so on. I mean, there's so many different forms of child abuse or child trauma that it really does include everybody. If you include the whole spectrum or the continuum, including, a mother that's ambivalent about a child in the womb and starts hating herself or wishing it was dead, just say, thoughts can traumatize at that level. So that at the largest definition of the spectrum, it absolutely includes everyone. But even if you narrow it down to sexual abuse, organized or disorganized, then, as I say, 50% or something like that, every other person. And one of the effects, as we kind of know, but again, difficult to talk about and understand, is the psychological fragmentation, compartmentalization that is most commonly associated with MK Ultra methods, using trauma to fragment psychologically the child. That means that people can know about something and yet not be able to think about it. It's difficult to describe, but one part, it's like having many personalities, and one personality will just know it's real and have a certain relationship to the knowledge and awareness, whereas another part is the part that's protecting and is denying that it ever happened. And even though the person's conscious mind may have discovered, as you say, organized Catholic child abuse, Jimmy Savile, Freemasons child abuse, Bill Cosby, Jeffrey Epstein, the list goes on, that they're still psychologically configured to deny it. So then they become absolutely divided. On the one hand, they will nod their head if you talk about it in a way that doesn't trigger their defensive mechanisms too much and say, yes, it's a terrible thing. But then if you go too far, you push the button, they'll call you a crazy conspiracy theorist, and as if they didn't know any of the stuff that they know that they know. So, it's an absolutely huge subject, and which is why I've written so many books around it.
I basically, and that was a psychological shock that started to make me think. And then very shortly after that, within a couple of years of that happening, a guy hired me to write an independent film that he wanted to introduce some elements of the Kennedy conspiracy. And this isn't crazy. This actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, this is, because I had grown up in my dad was a professor, and so I grew up under everyone I knew was an academic, and borders in academia about what is acceptable to look into and what is not acceptable to look into. So I had always looked at conspiracy theories as the way most people look at them, pejoratively. You're a conspiracy theorist. And then part of that goes back to what Richard Hofstadter was writing about in his book that came out in 1964, which is that a lot of the socialists, we're talking about Freemasonry, child abuse, are right wing. They're typically associated with uneducated folks who are super right wing, and that are tied, and it's tied into their general dislike of immigrants or anybody who's different, and so this idea that Hollywood's filled with perverts, that kind of thing, and so it serves to debase all such notions, and it successfully did in my case. Start working in this again. I keep calling it a field. I don't know what else to call it, the forbidden field or whatever. You keep running into it. Ed Curtin, who's a very fine researcher here in the States, and I said, I call this the weirdness, because you look into something for a while, like even the Kennedy assassination, and you start seeing the the weirdness, like these very strange connections, often to religious or quasi-religious ritual activity that then cuts into ritual child abuse. And, I don't want to know about this. Like this is not something, like I hated all that stuff. I'm like, oh God. But at a certain point, I found myself having to deal with it because it crops up so much. And then my wife is a trauma therapist, and after we got together, she had suggested that I could use some of the experiences of my own life to help folks with their recovery. And so I started working on I was part of what they call an ACT team, which is a bunch of people who go out to people's homes and hospitals and help, who are they typically are characterized as being dual diagnosis, which is to say that they have some sort of mental health condition that they're trying to overcome, in addition to addiction to a chemical or alcohol or whatever the case may be. And what you find when you do that, when you start talking to lots of people, is a couple of things. Exactly what you said, that there's early childhood trauma that is frequently sexual, and not always in a ritual sense, but just typically a family member. And that event, had a horrible effect on the rest of their lives. And they are medicating themselves to deal with that. And possibly, like, as you say, psychologically medicating themselves by creating these pockets for themselves so that they can exist in this area and not have to deal with this other thing that's in their brain. And you also find that people with schizophrenia will often be when they're doing their loose association and they're talking about these things, they will say things like, Robert Redford came to my hospital and had sex with me, and I had a baby, and then I had to kill the baby because they told me to kill the baby. And they'll make these sort of claims that parallel some of the real life claims that is going on in these abuse situations, where, we find, like Jimmy Savile, right? If Anne was, in her loose association said, oh, and by the way, Jimmy Savile raped me, that would likely be dismissed because this is a famous person and this is a woman who has schizophrenia. And so getting into that again was like getting a whole new perspective on this phenomenon. Is shit. And then it turned out that if I was meeting someone new, a client, and they were talking about what was happening to them, and they started describing certain details, I could then make a prediction of what branch of military service their father had been in.
Wow.
Because of the details of the ritual abuse.
Wow.
Yeah. And then it comes to find out that that's not uncommon, and that other people have made this same observation. And I don't want to go too far into that, but the practical experience is that if I think I know that your dad was an officer in this particular branch, and always officer. And that started to bleed into these other things and to give credibility to some of these other things too. Mm-hmm. And I think you described it very well in Prisoners of Infinity. The what you just said just now is that it's a really difficult road to go down, because you have there are psychological things that are going on in the body, in the mind. And then there are also these other things that are being hidden because they are secret and associated with these cabals. I mean, I really, whatever it is clearly very widespread and connects to the ordinary crimes of human beings. There's that one, that Sherlock Holmes story where Holmes and Watson are on the train, and Watson looks at these houses out in the country and says, "Oh, it's so peaceful." And Holmes says, "No, what I hear is the unheard cries of all the people who are being tortured in those homes. That there are unspeakable crimes going on in otherwise sedate villages." And so that is true. That seems to be true. And there's also this other thing, which is this organized situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
I don't know.
I mean, one of the things that's come to mind while you're talking was, you mentioned the right wing thing, which I won't get into that necessarily, but there's a correlation in many people's minds anyway between right wing and Christian. And there's certainly a correlation between, it was mostly Christians who believed the children and the Testament, the accounts about ritual abuse in daycare centers in the US. To this day,
yes,
a prominent figure like Jordan Peterson can dismiss that whole thing in the 80s as mass hysteria, because there's still a consensus around that belief that none of that happened. But in fact, there are a number of books, including one recently, Ross Chait, The Witch Hunt Narrative, that revisits the material. That's Oxford University Press, and plainly presents the evidence that it was real. Not that I ever doubted it myself, but that I meandered from my original point, which was the Christians. And of course, Christians, many of them believe in Satan, in a literal Satan, and those who don't certainly believe that there's some meaning in the designator of a satanic force in the world and even ruling over the world, as it says in the gospel. And although I'm not a Christian, I have sympathy with that perspective, and I feel that I kind of always have. So there's something, I'm getting in danger of getting a very large subject here, but again, in terms of the psychological configuration, I think there is a correlation between a rejection of what's going on at the deep, dark level of our society and a rejection of spiritual reality. I think those two things that clearly aren't synonymous, they are related. The reductionist, materialist kind of Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins kind of mindset that worships science and reason, and that's possessing our species currently with the COVID pandemic narrative and the pushing of fake vaccines and all the rest of it. People are just bowing down at the altar of science. That mindset is also the mindset that rejects any possibility of the things that we're talking about. And the obvious way to kind of crunch it down and simplify it is those who are, our ancestors, and even pre-Christian, but certainly post-Christianity, but pre as well, they always had a sense of the metaphysical dimensions of existence, of what, if we want to call them angels and demons, or elementals, or inorganic beings, or jinn, or fairies, or etc. Right? We've always had ancestry as a species until this last century or so. We've had a deep felt sense and awareness and a respect for the metaphysical or the hidden aspects of reality. And that's the context. Because if you believe in / are aware of, let's keep it on the focus of the malevolent, organized malevolence, demonic hierarchies that are involved in human affairs and manipulating human beings, and even sort of subtly directing and coercing human society and human groups and human organization, then none of these other things are that strange, unfamiliar, hard to believe or hard to understand, right? I know it's a big if, right? Because for the person who dismisses the things that we're talking about, they'll be even more dismissive of the thing that I'm talking about now. But that's kind of the point, really, that it's been a slow drip indoctrination by which human beings collectively and individually have become more and more close to, dismissive of hidden aspects of reality, good and bad, but kind of more specifically or more pertinently right now, the bad kind, the kind that are destructive and anti-life. And of course, that's made us much more easy prey, easy pickings, like duck in a barrel kind of thing for whatever it is that we're talking about. And I've, for whatever reason, even though I was raised an atheist, and this is an interesting fact, I think, for anyone who's has questions around this, because I wasn't indoctrinated with a Christian mindset. And yet, very early on, and yes, I read certain books, including Strieber, but before that, Castaneda, a number of books that you could say they certainly influenced me. But it's not as though, you know, I was a Christian just reading the Bible and believing it. I would say I had a felt sense of a certain reality, hidden aspect of reality, and I just became more fully conscious of it in my 20s by reading certain books. Now, some of those books, or all those books, might have been disinformational, as I explore in Prisoner of Infinity and other books, but that doesn't mean they don't have truth in them. You know, disinformation, 90% truth, 10% lies. So I would say as a child, probably like all children, I did have a visceral sense of hidden aspects of my existence, both socially hidden, as in child abusers obviously have to be discreet and creep into the room at the dark of night and disguise their predilections with charisma and so on, but also non-physical or metaphysical, hidden in that sense, as in they're not, our senses are, as they close down through trauma and other things, we can't perceive that there are other aspects to reality. And so I would say that although I closed down those senses, I didn't close them down so much that when I heard certain ideas or in certain interpretations, some part of me viscerally said, yes, I believe that. I believe that because it corresponds with some felt sense I have. And the felt sense that I'm getting or pointing to here is the felt sense that what we think of as reality is a kind of manipulation. What we think of as planet Earth isn't what it seems, and certainly what we think of as society isn't what it seems. I coined this phrase superculture, which is a play on supernature. Like the idea of the supernatural is that there's another world that the natural world is embedded in, but that's hidden. Right? But the natural world comes out of the supernatural world, because that's the hidden blueprint that creates the natural world. The elemental spirits and the angels and so on. They create this physical reality. And then culturally, it's true also. The culture that we perceive and think of as the whole thing is created and generated by a larger matrix. Oops.
I'm sorry?
I must have cut off.
Ow, shoot. Okay. I was just saying that I was just agreeing with what you said. And also, I was just saying that, when my biological father was Jewish, but I was raised by my mother in a Mexican-American family. So I'm a Mexican-American Jew. And so I was raised Catholic, was an altar boy, the whole thing. But I quickly discovered that I was not, teachers couldn't answer my questions and all that sort of thing. And so I would say that my intellectual hero when I was 12 years old was Bertrand Russell. But I would say that my intellectual hero now, to the extent that I have one, is probably Vine Deloria.
Well, I know
which
Bertrand
is to say
Russell,
that
but I
there's
don't
been
know the other guy.
Find Deloria is great. I'm writing so I have a book that's about to come out now, but there's a book that I'm working on that's going to get into some Vine Deloria stuff. You should. I think you'd really dig it. There's one book in particular called what is it called? Evolution, Creationism, and Other Modern Myths, which is a great book. Deloria was native, and he got tenure as a professor. And because he was both tenured and native, he basically wrote whatever the hell he wanted to. And so he was able to write these books that say some pretty astonishing things for an academic to say. But he had license to do it, and it was very hard for other academics to criticize him too much because of he was using his standing. And anyway, Vine was great, and he was very much talking about the disconnect from the earth, the lack of sacrality. One of the things that I find absolutely, I don't know, at various times astonishing, hilarious, and depressing about the modern culture that you just described is that there is this whole Sam Harris is a perfect example of like these intellectual idiots who have all of these extremely nutty ideas about the universe and who posit, like Elon Musk, someday I'm going to put my consciousness into a computer, which has to be among the dumbest things I've ever heard anybody say. Because if you try to walk through that process, like let's say for the sake of argument that it were possible to place a consciousness into a computer, which I don't believe it is, and I don't think it ever will be, but let's just take it as read that is possible. The level of trauma that would be associated with putting a human consciousness into a machine would render that consciousness insane. At least if you're talking in the spiritual world, you're talking about converting yourself into some sort of organic entity, right? It's a lot. I mean, I don't think I don't think you can put your consciousness into a bear either, but I think it would be easier to put your consciousness into a bear than a car.
Sure.
At least you are dealing, on the level of meat and electrochemistry and things that connect to one another and not, robots. But I do think it's interesting that there are so many people and I encounter them in the US all the time that will say, oh, ghosts are ridiculous and believing in God and Jesus is all a bunch of nonsense.
Yeah.
But there are multiple universes. Like these are equivalent ideas, guys. Like the only difference is that you're trying to provide some sort of physical evidential basis for having another universe that interacts with our own. And these physicists who have started to talk about simulation theory, I also think that's sort of humorous, because if you hired an epistemologist to discover reality and they come back and they tell you that, well, it's all a simulation, then they're fired. Right? They're the worst epistemologists who ever lived. They come back and they tell you that reality isn't reality. So I do think that there's a definite split into what people will accept as an intellectual idea and what people will accept as nonsense.
Yeah.
But these but they're not actually walking through these ideas to their core to see that oftentimes they're either equivalent, or frankly, that the spiritual explanation actually makes more sense than what this crazy physicist is saying.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I remember vividly in Russell's, I think it's in his History of Western Philosophy, where he tried to show that Marxism was equivalent to Catholicism, that they were putting Karl Marx on the cross in essence instead of Jesus. And what he was pointing out is that these ideas that don't have what he would consider to be an evidential basis are all sort of written in fairy dust. But he was taking this extremely narrow view of reality, which I can no longer accept. And in fact, I find a lot of this stuff preposterous. Like, although generally I believe in empiricism to an extent, we have to understand that as our limited human beings, there are colors we can't see, there are sounds we can't hear, and there are things that we will never be aware of because of the fact that we are in bodies, right? So there is no supernatural, in my view. It's all natural, but we don't have access to all of it at the same time.
Well, yes, I would go on with that, and I don't particularly like the term supernatural. I think it's symptomatic of that split that we would separate, and so it is a tricky thing to talk about. As organized child abuse is tricky to talk about because our faculties are impaired to some extent by the very thing that we're trying to talk about and identify and describe. So
yes.
we're looking into this cracked mirror, and so that we have this idea of the supernatural because our senses have been shut down and narrowed down to this very narrow bandwidth where we say this is the natural world, this is the material world, this is the physical world, this is what can be proved logically, this is what science endorses, this is what logic acknowledges, but everything else is just at best only accessible to intuition and at worst to superstition. But this itself is a symptom of our senses being closed down. So yeah, the more that we become aware of what our sense, the more our senses become open, so we become aware of what physical reality is and what nature incorporates, then the more that incorporates things that were previously identified as supernatural, or ditto with the culture and the superculture. One of the problems is that we've created these false narratives. Not only we've got the dominant false narrative now, which is the scientific one, which is reality is just what you can see, taste, and touch, and nothing else, etc., and trust the state and take the vaccine and shut up. That narrative. But then there's all these other false narratives which are considered superstitions, and to some extent rightly, that were created like myths as a means to that we didn't lose touch entirely with the larger aspect of physical reality that was becoming inaccessible to our senses. And so that's why I'm reluctant to talk about angels or demons or ghosts for that matter. And this does incorporate many of the human aspects of organized malevolence and conspiracy. It's also hidden in a similar way and also revealed in a similarly distorted way, that the language, the narratives we're given are, they're pointing to something real, but they're also obscuring it. Because if we take the menu for the meal, if we think that ghosts are literally like in a Charles Dickens story, or what happens to the dead, that relates to ghosts from a Charles Dickens story, or if we think, well, etc., right? You get the general picture, right? It's no substitute for direct experience, So if we just stop with the belief and settle with the belief, as most Christians do, I would say, they're not, they might have a slight edge over Sam Harris, right? In the fact that they believe in Satan, but it's kind of, it's a bit of a toss-up, really, because as I say, there are so many traps therein also, and the problem isn't what we believe and what we don't believe, but that we believe at all, essentially, and that we satisfy ourselves with belief rather than connecting to a felt sense of what's actually there. And
yes. So I think what I was inarticulately saying is that what I see are people choosing a particular dogma. So it's, you can choose your science dogma or your Christian dogma or your whatever. But what we should be doing, I think, is trying to explore as much as possible without these preconceived notions one way or the other. But we shouldn't be surprised, when we start looking outside the box, that we start finding things that are actually outside that box.
no.
Which is, and unfortunately, I experienced that because whereas I was perfectly willing, well, not perfectly willing, but after some years of investigating, I came to the unhappy conclusion that the government of the country that I live in murdered the president. They murdered Dr. Martin Luther King, and they murdered Malcolm X, and Jesus, and COINTELPRO, and all this. But then, wandering further, again, these little damned, it's like stubbing your toe. It's like, oh, here we go again with this ritual stuff. Mm-hmm. And then, frankly, it just became so pervasive that I couldn't ignore it anymore, and I had to go and start really working on it. And and so when you brought it up in the context, in Prisoners of Infinity, the context of the alien abduction phenomenon as being possibly I don't want to put words in your mouth, but a cover story, a way of understanding abuse that happened. What would you say?
A crucial fiction.
Am I screwing that? Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the central point or thrust there is to me anyway in Prisoner of Infinity around this question anyway of alien abduction, Whitley Strieber. It is this faculty we have for creating crucial fictions. And that's when you're talking about dogma, that's what you're talking about. A dogma is a crucial fiction. It's something that we create or cobble together or inherit or a combination of all three. And we turn it into something that provides meaning, purpose, and direction to our lives. And without it, we're basically lost. So yeah, Sam Harris, he's got his dogma of logic and science and whatnot. And Billy Graham or whoever's a current famous Christian uses those beliefs in the same way. And for Whitley Strieber, he was both a victim of and a perpetrator of a kind of prematurely created narrative around a phenomena that, like JFK, only more so, no one really has the full story about it, what's going on there. Because it's so many different things. I mean, even if you start with UFO, all it means is unidentified flying object. So that means absolutely everything, including an airplane sometimes, because if somebody can't identify it, then it's unidentified. Hello, right? So that, I mean, that's just a microcosm of the whole thing in a certain sense. We've got this phenomena that is somewhat familiar. It's familiar enough that we we think it's an object, we think it's flying, but there's an unfamiliar element and it makes it unidentified. Or with alien abduction, well, we know what abduction is, we think we know what aliens are, but essentially there's a very wide spectrum. For some presence invading one's private space, usually a bedroom in the dead of night, and well, if there's abduction, actually taking you away, but I would say it also includes just some sort of visitation, because I had experiences of waking up in the middle of the night in my bed or a bed or on the floor with something there in the room, and it very closely matched Strieber's and other people's accounts of an intruder, a non-human intruder in the room. Then we have the myths and the legends of succubi and so on. So again, and fairies, fairy lore involved people being taken off to fairyland and coming back transformed and so on. So first of all, we've got this phenomena that's probably prehistorical, but certainly throughout all of history and many, if not most cultures, of non-human interference with human beings and non-consensual generally. And then we've got what Prisoner Infinity focuses on more, which is the human exploitation and co-opting of whatever that is, either in the most fully deceptive way, as in just making it up, just wearing costumes and masks and acting out a bit of theatre to make Paul Whitley think that he was being abducted by aliens, when in fact he was being manipulated, abused, implanted and programmed, traumatized by human intelligence agencies. I lost the thread of that sentence, but that's I mean, it doesn't have to be either or, and my feeling with Strieber is that it isn't either or. I think that some of it was probably actual human theatre, and some of it was something that was genuinely mysterious, and that the two were somewhat coexisting. Now, which one came first and what the relationship is between the two, I don't even really try and speculate. But another thing here to make it even more confusing is that in the kind of theological, or whatever we call that, the Christian and other occults or Islam beliefs around inorganic beings such as demons or jinn, they're also inclined to come and interfere with humans. They're very interested in human organic processes and so on, for reasons that we could get into, but I say, simply speaking, they don't have bodies, so they're interested in what bodies are like. And their method is deception too. Of course, they're going to try and trick their subjects or their victims into believing that they're angels if they can, or extraterrestrials or angels, and so on. So again, I think there's a case of an unknown but very familiar aspect of reality being denied and shut out, and therefore running riot through our society and through our psyches. You know, when the cat's away, the mice will play. When the psyche isn't presiding over what's going on in the body, then a legion of foreign entities will enter in there and play havoc with it. And as within, so without. If we're internally colonized by who knows what, because there's cultural implants as well as ancestral and metaphysical, demonic, what have you, then we're not going to be able to perceive reality clearly. It goes without saying, doesn't it? If we're internally colonized, then our consciousness is compromised and our perceptions can be manipulated from the source.